Okay, it is 1 p.m. Eastern, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Mark Cancellari, and today's webinar is titled The Adaptation Workbook and Wildlife Adaptation Menu, Structured Flexibility for Management Decisions. And we're excited to have Dr. Stephen Handler with the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science with us today. We'll be introducing Stephen in just a few moments, but first I'd like to remind you of a few logistical details for our webinar. First and foremost, if you'd like to change your audio settings, that should be available to you at the bottom of your screen under a menu labeled audio settings. There you can test your speaker, switch to phone audio, and view other audio settings as needed. So first and foremost, thank you for tuning in today for the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Application and Migratory Bird Programs, the National Conservation Training Center are joining the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in sponsoring this webinar series. CEU credits are available for this series. You just need to contact me, Mark Cancellari, if you would like credit using the email on the screen, and we will put that email in the chat box here in a few minutes. First, as a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all participants have been muted, and it will remain that way for the duration of the webinar. But we do want you to participate. So at any time during the webinar, please post questions in the chat. To submit a question, first click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, then simply type your question into the chat box and press enter. Please make sure to address your question to everyone in that drop-down menu. That way, all participants can see your question, and that might generate further questions. We'd also like you to feel free to enter questions at any point during the presentation, and we are going to pause about halfway through the webinar to field some of those questions. And finally, if you wish to change your presentation view, you can access the different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of the screen as shown on this slide. Okay, I'm now going to turn you over to Maria Genoviak to tell us a little bit more about this series, as well as introduce you to our wonderful speaker today. Take it away, Maria.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Maria Genoviak. I'm with the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm really happy to be here as one of the co-organizers of this particular webinar series, and Stephen Handler was as well. We developed this webinar series as a 12-part series to go through the year. We're at presentation 8 of 12, and the intention was really to try to tell a story about climate change and its effects on ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife species. And so through the series of these particular webinars, we have looked at forest ecosystems and their composition and structure under a changing climate, and then also explored how that influences wildlife populations and things like carbon dynamics. Throughout this series, we're working to share tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscape and stand scales. And so it's really exciting to be here today to be able to share the next iteration of our series, which is, next slide, please. Stephen Handler's presentation, where he'll be discussing the Adaptation Workbook and the Wildlife Adaptation Menus. These are two adaptation resources that provide structured flexibility for making management decisions. We are recording this presentation, and we'll be posting it on the page for the webinar series, which I've posted here. So this should be up in a few days if you want to reference it or share it. We really appreciate that. And I also wanted to highlight that the next presentation in the series will be on December 13th at the same time at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And the topic will be persist in place or shift in space, applying assessments of species adaptive capacity to inform climate adaptation actions by Lindsay Thurman from USGS and the Northwest CASC. You can see the entire lineup on the website. And again, we post recorded presentations and slides after the presentations. And so as we mentioned today, I'll introduce Stephen here, and we'll be listening to his presentation, and we'll stop halfway to take a few questions, and then we'll have additional time for questions at the end. So I really encourage you to put those in the chat as they come to you, as you have ideas, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can in the time available, and we do have time set aside for that. And so I want to introduce Stephen Handler. Stephen Handler is a climate change adaptation specialist. He works with me at the USDA Forest Service and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And Stephen has more than 10 years of experience looking at climate adaptation efforts, and in particular coordinating efforts across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. He's worked on many different facets of climate change adaptation, including vulnerability assessments, adaptation planning, and technical assistance for a wide variety of natural resource organizations. And so today he'll be presenting on work that he and colleagues have worked on to develop an adaptation menu of a menu of adaptation strategies for wildlife, species, and habitats, and some examples of applications of that menu. All right, Stephen, you're up. Please enter those questions as you have them today.
Thanks, Maria. Let's see, I'm sharing my screen here. Moving things around. How's that showing up?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Maria, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. So yeah, like Maria said, I'm here to talk about a few resources that we think can help wildlife managers and land managers more generally think about climate change and how it relates to your work, and move forward integrating adaptation considerations into your work. Before I jump in, I should recognize a couple of partners that were critical to this effort. So Chris Swanston with the US Forest Service, Dr. Ben Zuckerberg with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Chris Hoving with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and Olivia Ledee with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. We're all partners on creating this wildlife adaptation menu that I'm going to be describing. Okay, so just first to get some things out in the open, I know you all have been on this journey with us through this webinar series. So you're used to thinking about climate change, wrestling with this issue. Sometimes some important barriers go unsaid, unstated. And so I just wanted to mention some of these right off of the top that we deal with all the time in our work at NIACS. And that were kind of instrumental to shaping how our organization decided we could be most useful in helping land managers grapple with climate change. So nothing revolutionary here, I'm sure, but it's good to say some of this stuff plainly. The first barrier we can acknowledge, those of us especially who are producers of climate change science, is that a lot of climate science is not being used to inform land management. There are mismatches in the scale and scope at which science is produced and the needs and decision space of land managers. Managers in many cases feel overwhelmed and isolated when addressing this issue of climate change. There's a huge volume of scientific research being produced that's impossible to keep up with. It's hard to share success stories and individual attempts at adaptation, get kind of lost in the overall churn of what's happening in a lot of our large land management agencies. And it can just be an intimidating topic to address, given that we're all already dealing with a host of challenges, such as managing threatened or endangered species, or addressing invasive species, that's all daunting. And then you throw climate change into the mix and yeah, things can start to feel like really long odds. And when visioning the future, there's not always a shared understanding of success. We're still in the early days, frankly, when it comes to climate adaptation. So our best practices or our norms haven't been firmly established. What looks like success between two different land managers or two different agencies might be quite different. And so therefore one size fits all prescriptions don't really hold up. So again, probably nothing eye-opening to many of you, but probably some things that you can agree with and that you see in your daily lives. And so this is where Maria and I worked out a dramatic trumpet music playing. Maria was going to bring in her trumpet to work today, but didn't. Sorry. Sorry to you all, but ta-da! Here's NIAX to help address some of these barriers. What is NIAX? We're a collaborative organization, a multi-institutional collaborative that is, thanks Maria, I see you participating in the chat, led by the Forest Service, but including many other partner organizations that are all part of our steering group or our board of directors, so to speak, including 4 universities around the Midwest and Northeast, a national conservation organization, that's American Forests, a forest industry science group, National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, and also a tribal commission. All of these organizations help describe what NIAX is and how we can be most useful. And what that boils down to is we develop synthesis products, foster communication, we pursue science, and provide technical assistance on climate change adaptation and carbon management. And our mandate is to work with anyone and everyone in the land management community who's ready to have these discussions about climate risk and adaptation. So we work with all shapes and sizes and any and all comers. So I want to test that chat screen again. And I'm interested to know, anyone out there, have you done a home improvement project lately that you can tell me briefly about? What have you done to get ready for winter, or something you've done interesting in your house lately? Because we're going to take a trip to the hardware store. Okay, Danielle, thanks. You're putting in floors. Okay, so yeah, oh well, okay, a whole bunch of busy beavers here on the chat. Well, we're going to go with Danielle first. So Danielle's putting in floors. We're going to take a trip to an imaginary and special hardware store with Danielle, because we need some tools to work on this project. Danielle and I enter the hardware store, and a couple of weird things start to become evident about this special, some might say metaphorical, hardware store. We notice, first of all, that this store is huge. It's bigger than we ever could have expected from the outside. And actually, as we walk around, it seems to be expanding all the time. Also, we notice that it is incredibly disorganized, right? There's plumbing materials mixed in with electrical. There's lumber mixed in with the paint. We're walking around for hours and we can't find that flooring that Danielle has been looking for. Some of the signs seem to be written in German and are intelligible to us. We can't make heads or tails of what happens to be in an aisle. And some of the aisles in this hardware store are blocked off. You have to pay a deposit just to walk down some of these aisles and see what's in them. And as we're walking around, getting frustrated, we also observe that about 25% of the store just seems to be hammers, row after row after row of hammers. So Danielle and I, we get frustrated and we decide to go to a different hardware store. Maybe we just postpone this project altogether because we've spent hours already. I'm belaboring this point. Hopefully you all are still on this ride with me. This is the experience that many wildlife managers are facing when you're asked to try to incorporate climate change into your work and try to find real world guidance, practical guidance on how to adapt to climate change risks that you may be facing. It's a swirl of information. It's too much to keep up with, and there are many barriers in your way. So the project that we set out to accomplish was to, number one, synthesize peer-reviewed recommendations for wildlife management under climate change, to try to organize and consolidate climate adaptation for wildlife management at a scale and resolution, to actually inform on-the-ground management decisions, and to demonstrate how this can be helpful to managers. Now, the final product, as you saw in our title here, is called a Wildlife Adaptation Menu. And I'm going to show you what that is in a little bit here. But first of all, I want to describe this resource that we're calling an adaptation menu. So if you're not familiar with our work at NIAX, or if you haven't heard this described before, an adaptation menu is basically a collection of possible adaptation actions that allows you to decide what is most relevant or what's most suitable for a particular location and a set of conditions. And a menu is all about choice and organization. Also, we're creating adaptation menus that are specific to a certain discipline or a topic within this broad world of natural resource management. Just like you might expect a different menu walking into an Indian restaurant compared to a Mexican restaurant, a menu of adaptation ideas will look very differently if we're talking about outdoor recreation compared to silviculture and forest management. So adaptation menus are specific to a discipline, and they're written in a language that you would expect coming from that discipline. Our team at NIAX has been using these adaptation menus to prompt brainstorming and to help land managers develop their own adaptation ideas for over a decade now. And some of the reasons why we have found success using adaptation menus include that they're helpful to create a consistent hierarchy and a consistent level of specificity when it comes to organizing adaptation concepts and ideas. You see the graphic over here on the screen. This gets at some of the terminology we use when we construct an adaptation menu. They're designed around these nested tiers called strategies, approaches, and tactics. Strategies being the most general, approaches being more specific under that, and tactics being the actual actions that a land manager might take on the ground. So moving further and further down in specificity until you're ready to take action with tactical level ideas. Adaptation menus help connect broad ideas to specific actions. So they're kind of like a series of stepping stones to move your way from general to specific and funnel you to ideas that seem most applicable and worthwhile for your particular context. And in so doing, in taking these stepping stones from general to specific, they also create a trail by which you are documenting the intent of a specific adaptation action. So a specific tactic that you come up with will have kind of a, what do you want to call it, a traceable account to show which general idea did you start with. And that helps dictate the intent of this specific thing that you are ultimately choosing to implement. And lastly, we found that our adaptation menus really help managers open their minds up and consider ideas that aren't normally in their normal toolbox, so to speak, to go back to the hardware store, right? These menus include a huge variety of adaptation ideas, including some mutually opposing ideas. So we're presenting you with, we think, kind of a wall-to-wall spectrum of different adaptation actions. As we go forward and develop adaptation menus, we have several that have been published, which I'll show in a second. There's a consistent process in adaptation menu development that we try to follow. They are all basically following the same schedule of literature review and synthesis to make sure that they are representing the literature in that particular field of natural resource management, and that they're reflecting the best available science. There's a lot of work that goes into binning and organization and getting, like I said, a consistent organization when it comes to specificity of ideas, and figuring out what can be lumped and what can be split. Several rounds of iterative testing with land managers in a workshop format to try to see how these ideas actually match up with the needs of land managers that we're trying to serve. And then finally, formal peer review and publication. Like I mentioned, our team at NIAX has created several adaptation menus in a variety of topics and disciplines within the general realm of natural resource management. You see here many that have been published and a few that are still in preparation. You can get all of these for yourself at our website, forestadaptation.org/strategies. And these adaptation menus, they're useful on their own, just to kind of boost creativity and help with brainstorming. But they're really most valuable when used in concert with a structured adaptation planning process. The planning process that we have developed at NIAX, going back over a decade now, and that we've used in a huge range of contexts, is called the Adaptation Workbook. I'm not going to dwell on this largely here, but I will say that this is a structured adaptation planning process similar to others you might have heard about. 5 steps that are basically a series of prompts and key questions that basically allow a land manager to use their own expertise and judgment to break this idea of climate adaptation into a sequence of logical steps. And as you go through the sequence of steps and answer the prompts, fill in your information, you are by default creating your own adaptation plan. So it's not a series of recommendations that we're expecting land managers to follow. Instead, it's a series of questions that allow land managers to build their own custom adaptation plan. And the 5 steps, nothing revolutionary here, but I will note that it starts with defining where you are and what your management goals and objectives are for a particular place, for a particular project, and that really drives the rest of the experience. Our menus of adaptation strategies and approaches really come in our 4th step of the process, and that is where we have already walked people through this process of articulating what they want to accomplish, thinking about how climate change presents risks and how climate change might play out differently at the scale of their project, evaluate whether their management objectives are still feasible and whether they want to proceed or whether they need to revise and update their management objectives. And then finally, this 4th step is about brainstorming and identifying the adaptation approaches and specific tactics that you might implement to address those risks or take advantage of any opportunities. And so that's where these menus can really inform the process and spark some new ideas. The Adaptation Workbook was designed for rigor and accountability. And so we are asking people to treat it like a workbook, right? You're documenting your thoughts the whole way so that when you complete the process, you have an entire record of your thinking, information that can be turned into a standalone adaptation plan or can be incorporated into another management document that you might be working on. And we've used this adaptation workbook now on over 500 real-world examples around the country with real people with real needs in real places, representing a huge diversity of different ecosystems, different focal wildlife species or habitats in different scales. So I would invite any of you to check out our website, forestadaptation.org, www.wildlifeadaptation.org/demos to see examples of any of these case studies as we continue posting them online. So that's all background, and hopefully get kind of the spirit of what these menus are and what we're trying to accomplish by creating these adaptation menus. Now we'll dive into this wildlife adaptation menu in particular. First, to set the stage, we decided that our target audience was going to be terrestrial wildlife managers. So sorry for those of you who are working in aquatic systems. We just decided that would expand the scope of the literature review too much and might require a separate product. So we're focused on terrestrial wildlife here. We realized early on that wildlife managers tend to see themselves in one or two, sometimes both camps, and that we needed to recognize both of these camps. And those are folks who manage and think about wildlife populations and population viability, population recovery, as well as folks who deal primarily with habitat management. Think of themselves as habitat managers. So you'll see the wildlife is kind of divided into those two halves. The process of creating this menu, briefly, like I mentioned earlier, built on a foundation of published literature. So we conducted a literature review with a couple of key search terms here that churned up over 2,000 results in terms of articles. From those, we were able to winnow them down to about 1,300 that dealt specifically with terrestrial wildlife. Going even further, we were able to identify about 500 that included specific management recommendations. And from those 500 odd articles, we were able to extract 2,300 specific management recommendations for climate adaptation. This lit review is all described in a publication led by Olivia Ledee. Maria can put a link in the chat to where folks can get this paper in particular. I'm showing a table here of some of the results that came from this lit review. And this gets to a couple of things that I mentioned in my extended hardware store riff at the beginning, if you wondered what the heck I was talking about. So you see here a breakdown of the management recommendations for wildlife management and climate adaptation that we extracted from the literature. Of the 2,300 distinct recommendations, almost 600 of them dealt with protected area management. Protected areas, protected areas, protected areas. That's most of what wildlife managers find when they go into the literature and see, how can I adapt to climate change? And that's great, but it's certainly not the only game in town, and it's certainly well beyond the decision space of most land managers. And if you look further down the list, some really important ideas and concepts with wildlife management. Wildlife disease, human-wildlife conflict, managing and enhancing survival at critical life stages. They're getting very short shrift in the literature. Widely underrepresented when it comes to climate adaptation. So this adaptation menu is a chance to rebalance things and present these ideas on equal footing, so that one idea is not getting buried, like that hardware store that is puzzlingly all hammers. Like I mentioned, we piloted this adaptation menu with real wildlife managers in a series of workshops. We had workshops around the Midwest and Great Plains that involved over 80 participants that brought almost 30 distinct project ideas that represented federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, conservation groups, private interests, private landowners, and also represented a huge variety of focal species and focal habitats, everything from insects to migratory waterfowl, snakes and turtles, American marten, everything in between. So we learned a lot from these workshops about how to improve the menu, some holes that were in the menu, ideas that we weren't reflected very well. And that really helped us create a product that we think is, in the end, much more useful. So I've been going a while. Now's a good time to crouch, see what kind of questions we have so far. Maria, if you have anything that we should address right away.
Yep, I have two so far, kind of two that are, one is kind of getting multiple votes. So let's go with that one first because it's also sort of a clarification question. It's about the scatter of projects on the demonstration website, and just people are noticing that there are not a lot of projects out west. And so the question is, have you seen a lack of interest in the Pacific Northwest and Western states, or is it more a case of not knowing about this process tool? So I'll let you cover that for scope, and I'll also, when you pick the presentation back up, I can share some of those relevant links that I think you'll allude to.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So the dots on the map. Yeah. This is a reflection of our organizational footprint at NIAX more than interest. This would be a good chance for me to just make up all kinds of fun stories about how people in Washington and Oregon don't care about climate change, but I'm not going to take that opportunity. Our group at NIAX, we are set up along the boundaries of the Forest Service eastern region. So we cover primarily a 20-state footprint that goes from Minnesota to Maine to Missouri to Maryland. There are some dots outside of that footprint because we routinely work with partners in other places around the country when asked. Primarily that's to help share our tools and resources through partnerships that go outside of the Midwest and Northeast. You know, working in concert with the USDA climate hubs or other organizations like that to build capacity outside of those regions. So that's a little geography explainer. Sorry.
No problem. And I'll also share for folks who are interested, with the Climate Change Resource Center website, I'll post the link. We've done some work to mesh our menus with some of the Western groups. And so there's a filterable tool of some Western adaptation practices that will be working as well. And Stephen, you might want to kind of recap to the geography for the menu itself. The other question yeah, so yes, exactly. John Wilson talks about the folks working on the Climate Change Adaptation Library for the Western United States, and we have a tool that combines all of the published menus from the adaptation partners in the Adaptation Library and the adaptation menus that Stephen mentioned together. So I'll share that briefly. Stephen, the other question was related to the scale of conservation planning that the menus can be designed for. Can they be applied for statewide planning? So if you want to give a preview now, and then you may answer this also later.
Great. Yeah, so first thing, the scope of the menu is not regional. We intended it to be a national resource. So the Wildlife Adaptation Menu, we think, includes ideas that are applicable across ecosystems and across regions. And we have worked with, I mentioned the pilot workshops. We've also held an online adaptation course, which I can mention later, that included participants from around the country using this tool. Shoot, now Maria, I'm blanking on the second half of the question.
It was about scale and states.
Yeah, so most of the projects that have used the Wildlife Adaptation Menu thus far tend to be kind of project scale, so that, you know, a collection of reserves for a endangered species, or, you know, one parcel of land that a manager is working on habitat improvements. That's probably the most comfortable place to use these menus, but we have several instances now of land managers and agencies using the menus at larger scale. So for example, in a forestry context, we have land managers using our adaptation menus to inform state forest action plans or land management plans that cover hundreds of thousands of acres. And so the wildlife adaptation menu could be used kind of topically to think about, okay, at a larger scale, which of these ideas can we promote and how at that scale of planning. And we would be excited to work with you about those kind of applications.
Great. All right. I'm going to have you keep going, Stephen. And please, for folks listening, please continue to put those questions into the chat. We'll have more time at the end. And so I know we're going to have a lot more coming up.
Okay, great. So I did this dramatic pause midway before actually showing you what does the wildlife adaptation menu look like after all this development and testing. So like I mentioned, we're dealing with a couple different tiers of specificity. Strategies, generally. Each strategy has some nested approaches that are more specific, and then potential tactics below that. So I'll show you the high level organization first. There are 13 general strategies in the wildlife adaptation menu. Like I mentioned, the first half or so of the menu is more about population management. So maintaining and enhancing genetic diversity, connectivity, intentionally shifting the geographic range, managing interactions and harvest regulations, disturbance and conflict. And then on the habitat side, there are ideas related to restoring and maintaining sources of food, water, and cover, adjusting food, water, and cover components of habitat to align with future conditions. Finally, we get our protected areas idea here, and then conserving lands outside of protected areas. And two strategies that came in and were really emphasized by the participants in our pilot workshops were 12 and 13 here, intentionally choosing in some cases to take no action, and engaging human communities in these wildlife management and conservation actions. So to show you the next level down, what is this? These are general strategies. What do some of the more specific approaches look like? So just picking a couple of these strategies. Number 3 was facilitating shifts in the geographic range of a species in anticipation of future conditions. Underneath that general idea, there's a whole host, 5 or 6 or more, specific approaches. I'm showing you just 3 of them here. In blue, those are yet more specific approaches. And then for each approach in the full narrative version of this wildlife adaptation menu, we provide a couple example tactics. These are, real world applications of this approach. So just showing a couple there, again, to give a flavor of the specificity. Another example, strategy 8, restoring and maintaining sources of food, water, and cover as components of habitat. And then underneath that, picking a couple of the approaches that you might find within that general strategy, and then a couple example tactics. And again, this is not telling people what to do. This is giving people some organized possibilities and some breadcrumbs to follow, to go from general to specific and find ideas that are appealing to you and might work in your situations. You can get the full adaptation menu at the link here. Is published this year in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. Maria shared a link earlier where you can get a link to a short version, longer narrative version, and the full manuscript. And I just wanted to call back to a great presentation that Dawn Magnus gave last month on this webinar series that included this really thought-provoking chart about some of the controversial or novel ideas that are out there in wildlife management and climate adaptation. And I was happy to see that all of these are included in the wildlife menu. So this includes some challenging ideas as well as some of the more run-of-the-mill and conventional stuff like creating larger protected areas. So I was happy to see that. I wanted to give a shout out to Don's presentation. A little more detail about application. Like I mentioned, we had those pilot workshops that included a broad cross-section of land manager types, shapes and sizes of projects, focal species and habitats. We did run that online national class over the spring in partnership with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We're using this tool now with Forest Service project planning teams when they go through the formal NEPA project planning process for Forest Service actions. So wildlife managers who are part of those teams now have this resource to brainstorm ideas and think about how they may contribute to the overall project that's being proposed. And again, I'll say that don't view it as a checklist. It is, we call it a menu because it is supposed to help you understand your possibilities, but really it's on your professional judgment and expertise as a wildlife manager to pick and choose what makes the most sense and to use the menu as a help, as a way to assist you express your intent or find maybe new ideas that you hadn't considered before. And whether it's the adaptation workbook or whether it's another structured planning process like RAD, we think the menu can still be really valuable to, again, flesh out ideas that are more specific and help people realize possibilities. Just to show, I think I'll stop with one example to show how we've used this menu with a real world project. So we had a great group from Nebraska come to one of our workshops. They were looking at wildlife habitat and sustainable agriculture along the Central Platte River. They had a 12-mile river corridor that was identified as a focal habitat area for migratory waterfowl, including sandhill cranes, other wildlife. They came in with some very well thought out objectives about kind of habitat composition and restoration that they wanted to see along the river corridor, as well as wildlife friendly agricultural practices that they were hoping to implement. We walked through this structured adaptation workbook process to help them identify and prioritize some of the climate change impacts that they thought were most meaningful and think about how they played out in this place. So you see here some of the things that were really top of mind for them as they considered climate change impacts along this section of river corridor. Something that was, I think, a really nice illustration of kind of thinking about climate change impacts in a place, context specific. The warming winters in this area have changed the timing and duration of ice jams along the river. So ice jams are not as common as they used to be. Those ice jams were really important for maintaining the broad braided character of this river corridor. And you see the change here in the river corridor structure from the late 90s to today. This in many ways is a winter dynamic. Changing winters are contributing to this kind of consolidation of the riparian corridor, which leaves less of those, kind of shallow islands and in corridor habitat for cranes and other wildlife. Going forward, just to show some of the adaptation actions this group of managers selected from the menu to inform their plan. And I organized these according to resistance, resilience, transition, just to kind of highlight that they found a spectrum of ideas in this menu, different ways to respond to climate change risks. And so this helped them flesh out some of their wildlife-friendly agricultural practices and document the intent of those to help describe to farmers in the area why might you want to do this, and how does it relate also to addressing impacts of climate change on wildlife that we care about. They were able to identify some more specific tactics to mimic or maintain natural disturbances in the river corridor to enhance habitat quality. That included doing some things that they don't ordinarily do, like conducting prescribed fire in the summer as opposed to the spring, and actually opening up some of these areas to grazing in the winter as conditions change. And then more transition-minded ideas, intentionally encouraging a change, actually replacing some of those conventional row crops in areas where they're able to work with farmers or acquire lands through easement to provide food sources over a greater period of time to account for shifting migration dates. And lastly, the last part of our adaptation workbook process is identifying things to monitor and information that you'll need to gather over time to know if your adaptation actions are indeed successful. So just showing some of the monitoring items that this team came up with to conclude their adaptation plan. So that was my brief tour. I think I'm going to stop early and see what questions we have. I'm happy to go back and share more details about the wildlife menu, but I'm interested to see what questions folks want to bring. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. Great. Awesome. I have one question that has come in, and so I'd encourage other folks to this is your time, get those in, and we'll go through as many as we can, and then also see kind of what else we can do in this time we have together. So one question, Sherry is working, she works with land conservancies, and she's interested in how this tool would relate to a land conservancy or land trust who is looking at their conservation initiative and trying to think about prioritizing conservation easements or using kind of other tools in the toolbox of land trust to for habitat restoration and biodiversity, and particularly where she is looking at is Arctic grayling along a river.
Yeah, so I think some of the ideas in this menu could be helpful to imagine different ways that you might prioritize the landscape. So for example, there's a strategy in here about obviously there's the one that I called out a couple of times, and that's establish and enhance protected areas or habitat reserves. Within that strategy, I mentioned all the hammers in the hardware store. There's something like a dozen specific approaches that describe different ways of orienting or managing protected areas specifically. And so you could kind of use that as a rubric to imagine different ways of prioritizing the landscape and kind of evaluate those against your conservation objectives. That might open up some new ideas. And then also there's a companion strategy here about establish and enhance it, or promoting wildlife conservation on lands outside of protected areas. And that might also contribute some ideas to, you know, working beyond our existing network of protected areas. So I would hope that you could use both of those to spark some new ideas.
Great, thanks, folks. Keep them coming. We had another question, or at least a comment from someone who's saying, we need this tool for the Pacific Northwest, including shrub steppe ecosystems. And so I'd be really curious, Stephen, if you were to think about having gone through this process with the Wildlife Adaptation Menu and all the conversations you've been having, and even, you know, last week talking with folks at the TWS meeting, is like, how far can we stretch this menu comfortably versus where would we need to think about maybe other resources?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In our online adaptation course that we ran this spring that we opened up to wildlife managers around the country, we had private lands wildlife biologists in Eastern Oregon. We had a guy in Wyoming who is a state agency wildlife manager. And we must have had a few others from kind of the inland Northwest. And they were able to use, again, these ideas, these general strategies and approaches, they're kind of agnostic to ecosystem type. So theoretically, you should be able to pick and choose ideas off of this menu and then write tactics that are specific to that shrub steppe ecosystem. So I would be interested in that for starters. I will say that our NIAX team, we do have some adaptation menus that are specific to different ecosystem types, like a more conventional forestry and silviculture menu. We have a grassland specific menu that is in development, and we also have kind of a arid lands, arid ecosystems menu that is in development with some partners in the West. And that probably will include some yet more specific nuance for that shrub steppe kind of habitat that wouldn't get picked up in this all-encompassing wildlife menu. So if you get in touch, I can share either of those drafts to see if they inform something, some thinking beyond this wildlife menu might.
Awesome. Yeah, we had a slew of comments. I'm sure I can't capture all of those, but I also wanted to note that somebody said that they are using this in the Northwest, and they found it really useful for thinking about strategies beyond the protected areas. And then you know, someone else had pointed out, of course, there's so many different texts coming in, that there are some, you know, shrub steppe publications that have come out with the Sage Grouse Initiative. And I would highlight that Climate Change Resource Center link that I sent out and the adaptation partners. I know that specific to sage grouse, there are some items, you know, in that Western resource as well. But I think, like Stephen said, you can use this in all sorts of places. Let's see here. All right, we might not get to all of these, but let's start rolling through these a little bit. So two-part question here. So kind of about the framework. So I'll ask it in two parts. First one, Stephen, is does the framework assist with establishing a long-term vision and steps that should be incrementally implemented? So I think this is more about kind of goals.
I'll say a couple of things about that. In the process of completing our adaptation workbook, we ask people to articulate their management goals and objectives and to specify the time frame relative to those goals and objectives. So we give people the opportunity to state their near-term goals and objectives as well as any longer-term ideas that might be out there. And then, you know, if you kind of set those apart as distinct ideas, you can kind of carry them through as separate threads as you complete the adaptation workbook process. So if, for example, if there's a distinct set of adaptation ideas that might be more pertinent in the short term for your short-term goal compared to your long-term, absolutely, we have folks kind of divvying up their ideas in that fashion. Also, the final step of our adaptation workbook process has to do with monitoring. And as a part of that, we ask people not just to brainstorm information that is valuable, but we also get them thinking about what will you do with that information when you gather it, and will that information help you make decisions? Are there critical thresholds or criteria that you may need to meet in the future, either to comply with some agency requirement or just to know eventually if you are in fact having a success with your adaptation action? And so that is also a place to give yourself some benchmarks to think about in the future and to set some kind of incremental goals or opportunities where you may need to change course if, for example, you don't meet this threshold that you were hoping in 20 years' time.
Cool. And then second question from the same person is, have you seen the menu used, the wildlife menu used with tools like the SER restoration recovery wheel to help develop, monitor, and assess focal areas for restoration?
I will say I am not familiar with our menus being used with that tool in particular, but we have used our menus in combination with other planning frameworks like structured decision making or scenario planning. We have some discussions right now about using our menus to inform people who are using the RAD framework. So I would be excited to learn more about that, to think what might be possible.
Great. Okay, it's starting to roll in. So one that I think is really cool is, has the use of the adaptation workbook fostered communication between different specialized resource managers, i.e. between forest managers, wildlife managers, and recreation managers, for example?
So this is one of the fun things that I get to do as part of my job. Within the Forest Service, our team at NIAX is kind of an internal resource to help national forests go through their internal planning processes, as you know, to help national forests complete project planning through the NEPA process. And the teams that plan those projects are called interdisciplinary teams. And so that's within a national forest, when they're planning work in a given area, they'll have a multidisciplinary team that includes a silviculturist and a wildlife biologist and a botanist and a recreation manager and an engineer who thinks about the roads. And so in our role at NIAX, we lead this whole team through the adaptation workbook. And now these different menus, when it comes time to brainstorm, these menus give everyone a chance to think about ideas that are specific to their discipline and their training. And then we get to talk about them all as a group and think about what ideas might complement each other. And if I'm going to do this, I also need to acknowledge for these other partners and these other resources in this area. So yes, that interdisciplinary conversation is really exciting, and we love doing that.
Great. I just wanted to note that we're coming up on the hour, so I realize some people may need to drop off. And so thank you for those of you who were able to join us and realize you may need to leave. We have maybe 3 questions left. So I think what we'll do is we'll just keep strolling through these. If this sounds good to you, Stephen, we can stay on a few extra minutes if folks want to, but also realize, folks may need to drop off. And so thank you again for joining. We will be sure to post the recording and make it available, and you can reach out to Stephen if you have additional questions. All right, so Stephen, there were 2 that were relating about kind of species movement. So I'm going to give you both questions. One's maybe more on, and you can there's wildlife and vegetation here, and you can decide how to handle this. So one question is this mostly for adapting habitats for wildlife, or are there also strategies for adapting to facilitate movement of forest vegetation species? And then kind of a somewhat related question is, does your workbook include thoughts, approaches associated with the movement of species specifically, risks, planning, conservation, etc.?
Yeah, okay, so maybe to take 1A and 2 together first. Yes, there are ideas in this wildlife adaptation menu that are specific to moving wildlife species and to preparing habitat to facilitate the movement of wildlife species. And so you'll see some of that in strategies 1, 2, and 3, and then also 9, I would say. So yes, that idea is kind of peppered through this menu. And this is one of those ideas where there are opposing and mutually exclusive ideas in the menu. Because you can imagine there are situations where you will not want to facilitate the movement and perhaps connection and hybridization of species. There are certain situations where you want to keep distinct species separate. But there are also situations where species movement is justified and makes sense, and opportunities to do it. So yes. And again, we don't play favorites here. So some of those ideas we are certain are controversial. We try to give them equal footing and equal explanation in this menu. And then B, we do have specifically a forestry and forest ecosystem management menu that includes some more specifics about, you know, tree species migration and different ways and approaches, different philosophies for helping forest species migrate. So I would encourage you to look at that menu if you're interested in more forest specific examples.
All right, great. Thanks again, everyone. I realize you might need to drop off. Stephen, we have a bit of a grab bag, so you can decide what to do with these. These are a little bit more of the, maybe a little bit farther afield. All right, so I need to get back to my list. All right, so there's a budding researcher who asked the question, what is the most accurate model to measure forest resilience in an ecosystem? And realizing that is like the question we're all chasing, but maybe if you wanted to provide a few, threads or comments on that.
Yeah, resilience is one of those words that is often used with good intention, but it's hard to sometimes hard to understand what's being meant when two different people can talk about resilience and leave with two very different ideas of what we're actually describing. So whenever you want to go down this road in any rigorous fashion, I think the most important thing is to decide resilience of what to what. And so when you're talking about resilience in a forest ecosystem, we need to talk about resilience of what. Are we talking about functional diversity being retained? Are we just talking about canopy cover that is necessary for a wildlife habitat, or resilience of economically merchantable tree species, right? There are many different definitions of what. So first I would say define that, and then of what to what. So are we thinking about any particular stressors or threats that are kind of maybe headlines of an anticipated change, and that would help you actually model or forecast would different adaptation actions more appropriately address or help cope with that risk. So I don't think I answered that question, but hopefully that helps think about how to be specific when you're defining it.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, that's a huge question, but I think it's a really important one. There's one I can handle with a quick message in the chat. So the last one I'll give you, Stephen, is so the question is kind of in one direction. You may insert a little bit more related to your work. Has there been thought about adapting this menu to industry groups? This particular person says, specifically, I work on mitigating effects of industrial developments in the oil sands region of Alberta, where the focus is on developing policies and practices around mitigation and restoration of anthropogenic disturbances that can be applied by industry groups.
Yeah, okay, so has this menu, or have we used this process with industry groups? I would say yes, and we are, that's still kind of a unexplored frontier for us, but I think it's something that is going to be emerging quickly. So for example, we have through time, we've been fortunate to work with a couple forest industry actors. So different private forest industry companies are organized different ways in different parts of the region. So I'll just use that term broadly for now, but we have worked with some private forest companies to develop their own internal climate adaptation plans. And that starts with kind of walking through the adaptation workbook of helping them articulate what are our goals and objectives for our operations, what are key climate change risks in our land base, and helping them think specifically about that, and then using perhaps not this menu, but other menus that we have. Forest management, transportation, and engineering often comes up to help them identify, well, what are the practices we can use to keep our operation viable and to cope with these changes that are out there. A new frontier that is bringing this up, or a new development that is bringing this up more often, is that forest sustainability certification standards, FSC and SFI, have both rolled out new iterations of their forest management standards that include more rigorous expectations on climate change adaptation. So more thorough documentation of climate change risks and more thorough explanation of how are you as a company going to adapt to those risks. And we think our adaptation workbook as a planning process and the menus can help forest industry develop those adaptation plans. And so we've started some new efforts under the banner of those certification standards to help people have that discussion and to do that planning.
Awesome. That is it. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you everyone who attended and everyone who has stuck on. We still have a good group of folks, and so we appreciate this. We will work to get this posted on our web link. Also, I've posted the email for continuing education credits in there. If you didn't grab that earlier, please grab that. And we hope to see you next month. Have a great rest of your day.